21 miles. That is the width, at its narrowest point, of a strip of water sitting between Iran and Oman. Even a strong swimmer would need most of a day to cross it, if the currents allowed it. A confident sailor could cross it before lunch. And yet, every single day, roughly a fifth of the world's oil, enough to fuel hundreds of millions of cars, heat tens of millions of homes, and keep entire national economies breathing, passes directly through that 21-mile gap. This is not a hypothetical. In 2026, it happened. For months, that 21-mile gap was effectively closed to normal commercial traffic, and the consequences did not stay in the Middle East. They showed up in shipping invoices in Shanghai, fuel contracts in Frankfurt, and grocery prices from Lagos to Sao Paulo, within days of the closure and for months afterward. This is the strange, almost absurd truth about the global economy. It does not run on the size of countries, or the size of their armies, or even the size of their economies. It runs on a small number of extremely narrow, extremely exposed points on the map, choke points, where geography forces nearly all of the world's trade to squeeze through a space you could, in some cases, throw a rock across. So here is the question this episode is built around, and the one we will not fully answer until the very end. If a handful of countries can quietly control these choke points, have they effectively gained control over the entire global economy, without ever firing a shot? To answer that, we need to understand what these places actually are, why they exist, and why nearly every major power on Earth has organized parts of its foreign policy, its navy, and its trade strategy around a small number of narrow waterways most people couldn't find on a map. But to understand why this matters, you first need to see exactly where it sits on the map. A choke point, in the language of global trade, is any place where geography forces a large share of the world's shipping, energy, or data traffic into a single, narrow, defensible corridor. It can be a strait between two landmasses, a canal cut through an isthmus, or a channel between islands. What makes it a choke point, rather than just a body of water, is concentration, the fact that there is no easy way around it. Roughly 80% of global trade by volume still moves by sea. Container ships, oil tankers, and bulk carriers move more goods more cheaply than any other form of transport ever devised. But the ocean is not an open highway. It is shaped by continents, depth, currents, and politics. And that shape forces almost all of that trade through a surprisingly small set of doors. Let's lay out the main ones, because once you see them together, the pattern becomes impossible to unsee. The Strait of Hormuz, between Iran and the Arabian Peninsula, is the single most important oil choke point on the planet. Roughly a fifth of global petroleum liquids consumption passes through it, originating from Saudi Arabia, Iraq, the United Arab Emirates, Kuwait, and Qatar. The Strait of Malacca, between Indonesia, Malaysia, and Singapore, is the shortest sea route connecting the Indian Ocean to the Pacific. Estimates from institutions like CSIS and the EIA put its share of global maritime trade anywhere from a fifth to a third, depending on what's being measured, including the majority of the oil that fuels China, Japan, and South Korea. Bab-el-Mandeb, the Gate of Tears, connects the Red Sea to the Gulf of Aden, between Yemen and the Horn of Africa. It is the southern gateway to the Suez Canal, and together, these two choke points form the primary sea bridge between Asia and Europe, a route that, before Suez existed, required sailing around the entire African continent. The Bosphorus and Dardanelles, controlled by Turkey, are the only sea route connecting the Black Sea to the Mediterranean, meaning every barrel of oil and every ton of grain leaving Russian and Ukrainian ports by sea has to pass through a city of 16 million people, with a single country holding the keys. The Panama Canal, cut through Central America, lets ships move between the Atlantic and Pacific without sailing around South America, saving roughly 8,000 miles on a voyage between New York and San Francisco. The Danish Straits control the only sea access from the Baltic to the open Atlantic, meaning everything Russia, Poland, the Baltic states, and northern Germany shipped by sea has to pass a stretch of water Denmark could, in theory, close in an afternoon. And the Taiwan Strait, while not a canal or a narrow choke point in the traditional sense, sits at the center of the most important manufacturing relationship on Earth, the production of advanced semiconductors, making it a choke point not of oil, but of the technology that runs nearly everything else. What's remarkable is how these choke points overlap. The same narrow waterways that carry oil also carry grain, electronics, fertilizer, and, increasingly, the undersea fiber optic cables that carry the internet itself. Roughly 95% of intercontinental internet traffic still moves through cables on the seafloor, and many of those cables run directly alongside the same choke points that carry the world's oil. This is not an accident of nature. Trade has followed the path of least resistance for thousands of years, and the path of least resistance keeps running through the same handful of geographic bottlenecks, places where continents nearly touch, where currents are favorable, where the water is deep enough for modern shipping, and where, for one reason or another, no easier alternative has ever been built. And that is precisely why these places have been fought over for centuries, long before oil or container ships existed. The Ottoman Empire built its wealth partly on controlling the Bosphorus. Britain fought wars to secure the route to India through Suez. The United States built the Panama Canal, then spent nearly a century making sure no rival power could threaten it. Singapore exists as a modern global financial hub, largely because of its position on the Strait of Malacca. In other words, these are not just shipping lanes. They are some of the most strategically valuable pieces of real estate on the planet. And the countries that sit on them have always understood something the rest of the world tends to forget: that controlling a choke point is, in practice, a form of controlling everyone who depends on it, and that geography hides a fragility almost nobody talks about until it breaks. Let's start where the stakes are highest, the Strait of Hormuz. At its narrowest point, the shipping lane through Hormuz is only about 2 miles wide in each direction, separated by a buffer zone with Iranian waters on one side and Omani waters on the other. Every supertanker that passes through spends hours within easy range of shore-based missiles, fast attack boats, and naval mines, all without ever leaving international shipping lanes. This is why Hormuz functions less like an open sea and more like a permanently contested corridor. For decades, Iran threatened to close the strait without ever fully doing it, and the United States kept a permanent naval presence in the region for exactly one reason: to make the cost of closing Hormuz too high for any actor to attempt it. Then, in 2026, that equilibrium broke. On February 28, 2026, the United States and Israel launched coordinated airstrikes against Iran. Within days, Iran's Revolutionary Guard Corps Navy declared the Strait of Hormuz closed, laid sea mines along the shipping channel, and began boarding and attacking merchant vessels that attempted to pass. By early March, tanker traffic through the strait had collapsed to a fraction of its normal volume. At the peak of the crisis, more than 1,500 commercial vessels and over 20,000 mariners were stranded in and around the Persian Gulf, unable to safely exit. The world's largest container carriers, Maersk, MSC, CMA-CGM, Hapag-Lloyd, suspended transits entirely. War risk insurance premiums, which normally cost a fraction of a percent of a ship's insured value, rose to several times their pre-crisis level within days and kept climbing as the conflict continued. The United States attempted to reopen the strait by force, striking Iranian naval assets and missile positions along the coast, and later imposed its own naval blockade on Iranian ports in response to stalled negotiations. Analysts at the International Energy Agency would later describe it as the largest disruption to global oil markets in the history of modern energy trade, larger than the 1973 OPEC embargo. A ceasefire and memorandum of understanding was signed on June 17, 2026, raising hopes the strait would reopen. That truce did not hold. By early July, Iran resumed attacks on commercial vessels. The United States struck back, and the strait fell into closure again. As of this recording, it remains effectively shut, with only a small fraction of normal traffic attempting the crossing, and insurance rates running at multiples of their already elevated crisis levels. The lesson of 2026 is not that Hormuz can be closed. Everyone already suspected that. The lesson is what closing it actually costs and how long it takes to undo. Even the country that closed it lost billions of dollars in oil revenue in the process. Even the country that tried hardest to reopen it by force could not do so quickly. A 21-mile gap of water proved stronger than two of the most capable militaries on Earth, at least for a while. Not because either side lacked the power to force the issue, but because neither side could make the underlying economics of forcing it worth the cost. Now travel 4,000 miles east to the Strait of Malacca, and the dynamic changes entirely. Where Hormuz is a story about military risk, Malacca is a story about sheer physical limits. At its narrowest point, the strait is only about 1.5 miles wide, and large sections are dangerously shallow for the modern supertankers that now dominate global oil shipping. Some of the largest vessels in the world physically cannot pass through fully loaded. They have to partially offload cargo first, a constraint known in shipping circles as Malacca Max. More than 100,000 vessels pass through the Strait of Malacca every year, a record as of the most recent data. That is roughly one ship every 5 minutes around the clock in a corridor narrow enough that a single grounded vessel, as the world saw in the Suez Canal in 2021, could paralyze global trade for days or weeks. This is the choke point China worries about more than almost any other, because the overwhelming majority of China's oil imports pass through it. Chinese strategists even have a name for this vulnerability: the Malacca Dilemma, the recognition that China's economy depends on a strait it does not control, patrolled in part by navies it does not trust, namely the United States and its regional allies. It is precisely this dilemma that has driven a huge share of China's infrastructure investment over the past 2 decades. Pipelines through Myanmar and Kazakhstan, rail corridors through Central Asia, port investments in Pakistan's Gwadar and Sri Lanka's Hambantota. Each of these projects on its own looks like ordinary infrastructure development. Together, they form a deliberate strategy to reduce dependence on a single narrow strait that China does not control. Now move to the Red Sea, where 2 choke points work as a pair: Bab-el-Mandeb at the southern entrance and the Suez Canal at the northern exit. The Suez Canal is, in some ways, the purest example of a man-made choke point. Before it opened in 1869, a ship travelling from London to Mumbai had to sail around the entire continent of Africa, a journey of roughly 6 months. Suez cut that down to a matter of weeks. Today, around 12% of global trade by volume passes through a canal that, at its narrowest, is barely wide enough for 2 large container ships to pass each other. In March 2021, a single container ship called the Ever Given turned sideways in a sandstorm and wedged itself across the canal. For 6 days, one ship, 20,000 containers, 400 meters long, blocked an estimated $9 to $10 billion of trade per day. Over 400 vessels backed up at both ends of the canal. Some shipping companies, rather than wait, began rerouting around Africa, adding weeks and millions of dollars in fuel costs to their voyages. That single incident, lasting less than a week, demonstrated something every government with a navy already understood. A choke point does not need to be deliberately closed by a hostile power to cause global economic damage. It can be closed by an accident, a single vessel, a sandstorm. And just south of Suez, Bab-el-Mandeb has shown the more deliberate version of the same vulnerability. Beginning in late 2023, attacks launched from Houthi-controlled territory in Yemen targeted commercial shipping transiting the Strait, forcing many of the world's largest shipping companies to suspend Red Sea transits entirely and reroute around the Cape of Good Hope, adding roughly 10 days and thousands of miles to journeys between Asia and Europe. This is the layer most people miss when they think about choke points. The threat does not need to physically close the route. The mere possibility of attack is often enough to make shipping companies and insurers choose the much longer, much more expensive route voluntarily, which means a choke point's value, to whoever threatens it, is not in shutting it down, but in making everyone else afraid to use it. Now consider the Bosphorus, arguably the most legally unusual choke point on Earth. Under a 1936 treaty called the Montreux Convention, Turkey has the legal authority to restrict naval, though not commercial, passage through the strait during wartime, even though Turkey is not directly a party to most of the conflicts that pass through its waters. When Russia invaded Ukraine in 2022, Turkey invoked Montreux to close the strait to warships from both sides of the conflict, Russian and Ukrainian alike, along with any additional warships from other powers. A single legal decision by Ankara that reshaped naval access to the entire Black Sea. For Ukraine, a major global grain exporter, this mattered enormously. Most of Ukraine's grain exports, wheat that feeds tens of millions of people across the Middle East and North Africa, depend on safe passage through the Black Sea and out through the Bosphorus. When Russian naval forces blockaded Ukrainian ports early in the war, Global wheat prices spiked, and countries as far away as Egypt and Lebanon, heavily dependent on Ukrainian grain, faced real food security concerns. Finally, travel to Central America, where the Panama Canal shows yet another kind of choke point vulnerability. Not military, not legal, but environmental. The canal depends on freshwater lakes to operate its lock system, and in 2023 and 2024, a severe drought forced the Panama Canal Authority to dramatically cut the number of daily transits, in some periods by nearly half. Shipping companies faced weeks of delay, and some chose to reroute around South America entirely rather than wait. For the first time in the canal's modern history, climate, not conflict, was the choke point's biggest threat. Put these together, and a pattern emerges. Hormuz is vulnerable to deliberate military closure, and in 2026 proved it. Malacca is vulnerable to physical limits and a single grounded ship. Suez and Bab-el-Mandeb are vulnerable to both accidents and deliberate attacks. The Bosphorus is vulnerable to a single country's legal decision. Panama is vulnerable to drought. Each choke point has a different weak point, but every single one shares the same underlying truth. An enormous share of global trade depends on a small number of places that can be disrupted by forces far smaller than the trade itself. But the real story isn't what happens on the map. It's what happens to the money. Every one of the disruptions we just walked through, big or small, accidental or deliberate, eventually shows up in the same place: price. When the ever-biggin blocked the Suez Canal for 6 days in 2021, oil prices rose roughly 5% in a matter of days, even though the canal carries only a fraction of global oil. Because markets do not just price in what has happened, they price in what could happen next. When Houthi attacks forced shipping companies away from the Red Sea in late 2023 and into 2024, insurance premiums for vessels transiting the region rose by a factor of 10 or more in a matter of weeks, and some of the world's largest shipping firms, Maersk, MSC, Hapag-Lloyd, suspended Red Sea transits entirely. This is the first hidden mechanism behind choke point geoeconomics. Risk has a price, and that price gets paid by everyone, even countries with no ships anywhere near the choke point in question. A shipping company rerouting around Africa doesn't just absorb the cost itself. It passes that cost down the supply chain into the price of every container, every barrel, every bag of grain that eventually reaches a store shelf on the other side of the world. The insurance industry has its own name for this. It's called war risk premium, and it works almost like a tax that gets applied the moment a region becomes unstable, regardless of whether an actual attack ever happens. Underwriters at Lloyd's of London and similar markets constantly reassess which waters count as high risk, and when a strait crosses that line, every ship transiting it pays more, every single day until the assessment changes. That premium doesn't disappear once it's charged. It moves downstream, embedded in freight rates, then into the price of the goods those ships are carrying, arriving at a supermarket shelf or a gas pump months later, disconnected from the headline that originally caused it. The 2026 Hormuz closure put a number on exactly how expensive this can get, even for the country doing the closing. By early May 2026, US defense officials estimated Iran had lost several $billions in oil revenue as a direct result of the closure and the American naval blockade that followed. A striking reminder that closing a choke point is not free, even for the party with the most to gain from using it as leverage. On the other side of the ledger, countries holding strategic petroleum reserves, stockpiles of oil set aside specifically for supply shocks, found themselves drawing down those reserves for the first time in years, converting a geopolitical crisis half a world away into a very domestic decision about how much oil to release and at what price to keep their own economies stable. The second mechanism is about who gains and who loses when a choke point becomes unreliable. And the winners are rarely who you'd expect. When ships avoid the Red Sea and sail around the Cape of Good Hope instead, the voyage becomes longer, which means more fuel burned, more crew time paid, and more capital tied up in transit. But it also means South African ports, along the rerouted path, see a surge in business. Refueling, resupply, repairs, turning a crisis for global shippers into a windfall for a country that, geographically, simply happened to be in the way of the new, longer route. Something similar happened with the Panama Canal drought. As transit slots became scarce and expensive, some shippers began routing cargo through Mexican and US land bridges instead, moving goods by rail across Mexico's Isthmus of Tehuantepec, or unloading on one US coast and trucking cargo to the other. Mexico, almost by accident, became a temporary beneficiary of a Central American canal's bad year. The 2026 Hormuz crisis produced its own version of this pattern in the Gulf itself. Ports outside the Strait, on the Omani coast, along the UAE's eastern seaboard, saw a surge of activity as oil producers scrambled to move crude by pipeline to terminals that never required passing through Hormuz at all. Existing pipeline capacity across Saudi Arabia and the UAE, built years earlier as a hedge against exactly this scenario, suddenly became some of the most valuable infrastructure in the region, even though it could only carry a fraction of what the Strait normally handled. This is the broader pattern worth understanding. Choke point disruptions don't just punish the unlucky. They quietly redistribute economic advantage toward whichever alternative route happens to be available. And the countries that own those alternative routes know it. Which brings us to the most important geoeconomic trend of the past 2 decades: the deliberate construction of alternatives to existing choke points by countries that no longer want to depend on routes they don't control. China's Belt and Road Initiative is, in large part, a choke point avoidance strategy disguised as an infrastructure program. Pipelines through Kazakhstan and Myanmar reduce China's dependence on the Strait of Malacca for oil and gas. Port investments in Gwadar, Pakistan, connected to Western China by road and rail, offer, at least on paper, a route that bypasses the Indian Ocean choke points entirely. None of these alternatives can fully replace seaborne trade through Malacca, but each one chips away at the leverage that route gives to whoever controls the surrounding waters. It's worth being honest about the limits of this strategy too. Pipelines and railways move a small fraction of what a supertanker can carry in a single voyage, which is exactly why, decades into this effort, China still moves the overwhelming majority of its energy imports by sea, through the strait it was trying to avoid in the first place. The India-Middle East-Europe Economic Corridor, announced in 2023, represents a parallel logic from a different set of countries. A rail and port network intended to connect Indian ports to European markets via the Gulf states and Israel, explicitly positioned as a faster, more secure alternative to relying solely on the Suez Canal route. Like China's pipelines, it faces the same basic constraint. Rail and road can never move cargo as cheaply at the scale that container ships do. What these projects buy isn't a replacement for the choke point. It's optionality, a fallback that becomes valuable precisely in the moments when the main route becomes unreliable, even if it's uneconomical the rest of the time. And in the far north, melting Arctic ice is slowly opening what Russia calls the Northern Sea Route, a path connecting Europe to Asia along Russia's Arctic coastline, bypassing Suez and Malacca entirely. It remains seasonal, expensive, and heavily dependent on icebreaker support. But every year it becomes marginally more viable, and Russia has made no secret of its interest in positioning the route as a long-term alternative to choke points it does not control. If the Arctic route ever becomes commercially reliable year-round, it would represent something genuinely rare in this story, a brand new choke point, controlled by a single country, emerging almost entirely because of climate change rather than engineering or conflict. There is one more choke point that doesn't fit the traditional mold, and it might be the most consequential of all: the Taiwan Strait. Taiwan produces over 90% of the world's most advanced semiconductors, the chips that power everything from smartphones to fighter jets to the data centers running artificial intelligence. This is not a choke point defined by a narrow shipping lane. It's a choke point defined by a single island's near monopoly on a technology the entire global economy now depends on. Some analysts call this concentration Taiwan's Silicon Shield, the theory that the island's economic irreplaceability is itself a form of deterrence, since a conflict that disrupted chip production would inflict catastrophic damage on every major economy, including the aggressor's own. If shipping through the Taiwan Strait were disrupted, whether by conflict, blockade, or even the threat of either, the damage would not be measured in delayed cargo or higher insurance premiums. Analysts at institutions ranging from Bloomberg Economics to the Rhodium Group have estimated that a serious disruption to Taiwan's chip exports could cost the global economy well over $1 trillion, because almost nothing in the modern economy, from cars to phones to military hardware, can be built without the chips that flow through this single, heavily contested strait. Unlike oil, which can be stockpiled in reserves and released gradually during a shortage, advanced chips can't easily be stored against a future shock. Fabrication is a continuous, just-in-time process, which means a disruption doesn't just slow the flow of a finished good, it can halt production of everything downstream almost immediately. This is why the United States, Japan, and South Korea have spent the past several years subsidizing chip fabrication plants on their own soil at enormous cost, even though none of them can currently match Taiwan's precision or scale. It is not a bet that these efforts will replace Taiwan anytime soon. It's a hedge against the same lesson every other choke point in this episode has already taught: that even a small chance of disruption is expensive enough to justify building a fallback long before that fallback is actually needed. This is why so much of US, Chinese, Japanese, and South Korean strategic planning over the past decade has quietly centered on the same question that has shaped choke point strategy for centuries. What happens if the route we depend on stops being reliable? And who benefits if it does? Which leaves us with one final question, the one that changes how you'll read the news from now on. So let's go back to where we started. A 21-mile gap of water, and the question of whether controlling it, and places like it, amounts to controlling the global economy itself. The honest answer is more interesting than a simple yes or no. No single country fully controls global trade through choke points, because no single country controls all of them. Iran sits on Hormuz, but not Malacca. Turkey sits on the Bosphorus, but not Suez. The United States built and long controlled Panama, but does not control Hormuz or the Taiwan Strait. China depends on Malacca more than almost any other country on Earth, but does not control a single mile of its shoreline. Power over choke points is fragmented, deliberately and otherwise, among rival states that watch each other closely, precisely because none of them wants any single actor to hold all the keys at once. That fragmentation is not an accident of history. It is, in a strange way, the closest thing the global trading system has to a safety mechanism. No one power center, however large, gets to decide unilaterally whether the rest of the world eats, drives, or manufactures. History has tested this fragmentation before, and it has held, again and again, for a simple reason. Every empire that ever tried to convert choke point control into total leverage discovered the same limit. The Ottomans controlled the Bosphorus for centuries, taxing and regulating trade through it. But they never used that control to strangle Europe outright, because European buyers were also Ottoman revenue. Britain fought wars to secure Suez, then spent decades defending the principle that the Canal should stay open to everyone, allies and rivals alike, because a closed Suez would have hurt British trade just as much as anyone else's. The United States built the Panama Canal and controlled it outright for most of the 20th century. Yet even at the height of that control, Washington kept the canal open to hostile and friendly shipping alike, because an American choke point used as a weapon would have justified every other power building around it. Choke point control has always come with this same built-in restraint, whether the controlling power fully wanted it or not. But fragmented control is not the same as no control. What 2026 proved, in the most expensive way possible, is that even a country willing to pay an enormous price can shut one of these doors, and that shutting it costs everyone, including the country that did it, far more than anyone expected. A 6-day blockage in Suez, a drought in Panama, months of closure in Hormuz, involving two of the most capable militaries on the planet, interrupted briefly by a truce that collapsed within weeks, dragging the Strait back into the same contested standoff it had held since February. Look closely at what has actually happened since the 2026 crisis began, and the lesson sharpens further in an uncomfortable direction. There was no clean battlefield victory. There was no naval blockade succeeding where diplomacy failed, even though one power tried exactly that for weeks, with some of the most advanced military hardware ever deployed to the region. There was a memorandum of understanding signed at a table months after the first missile was fired, and it collapsed within weeks because a signature on paper could not override the incentives that produced the closure in the first place. Closing Hormuz has already cost Iran billions in lost revenue. Reopening it by force has cost the United States months of naval deployment, diplomatic capital, and a bill that dwarfs the value of the oil either side is fighting over. Both sides understand this math, and still, as of this recording, the Strait remains closed. That is not weakness. It is the same logic that has governed chokepoint behavior for centuries, playing out in real time on the largest and most consequential scale anyone has seen it play out before. That's the deeper pattern underneath everything we've covered. Geography gives a small number of countries outsized leverage over the rest of the world. But geography also traps those same countries inside the consequences of using that leverage. Iran controls Hormuz, but Iran also needs the oil markets that Hormuz serves. A permanently closed strait would have eventually strangled Iran's own economy as thoroughly as it strangled everyone else's. China depends on Malacca more than any other major power, but China cannot simply seize it without inviting a coordinated response from every navy in the Indo-Pacific that also depends on it staying open. Turkey holds the legal keys to the Bosphorus under a 90-year-old treaty, but Turkey's own economy depends on the trade that those keys are meant to protect, which is exactly why Ankara has used that power so sparingly and so carefully in the decades it has held it. Egypt built its modern economy partly around Suez Canal revenue, which means Egypt has more incentive than almost anyone on earth to keep that canal open and running smoothly. Choke points, in other words, don't hand out clean power. They hand out leverage wrapped in liability. And every country sitting on one has spent decades, in some cases centuries, learning exactly how much of that leverage it can actually afford to use before the liability side of the ledger catches up with it. This has one more layer worth sitting with, because it's the layer that connects everything we've covered to what happens next. Every alternative route we discussed, the pipelines through Kazakhstan, the corridor through the Gulf and Israel, the melting Arctic passage, the new fabrication plants in Arizona and Kumamoto, exists because someone, somewhere, ran the same calculation Iran and the United States ran in 2026, years in advance, and decided the insurance was worth buying before the crisis arrived rather than after. None of these alternatives are cheap. None of them are close to replacing the choke points they're meant to hedge against. But that was never really the point. The point was optionality. Having somewhere else to turn, even a worse and more expensive somewhere else, in the exact moment when the main route becomes unusable. Countries that had spent that money before 2026 weathered the Hormuz crisis better than countries that hadn't. That is likely to be true of the next crisis too, wherever it happens to strike. And there will be a next one. Not because any particular government wants one, but because the underlying geography that makes choke points valuable hasn't changed and won't. The Taiwan Strait carries a risk profile unlike anything else in this episode. Not oil, not grain, but the semiconductors that the entire global economy, including artificial intelligence, defense systems, and basic consumer electronics, now depends on almost entirely. Unlike oil, chips can't be pulled from a strategic reserve during a shortage. There is no equivalent of releasing 400 million barrels from an emergency stockpile when a fabrication plant goes offline. That asymmetry between a commodity that can be stockpiled and a technology that can't is precisely why so much quiet, expensive infrastructure spending has gone into building chip capacity outside Taiwan over the past several years, even though everyone involved knows those new plants can't fully replace what's concentrated on that single island. The same silicon shield logic that makes Taiwan valuable enough to defend also makes it valuable enough to fight over, and no amount of diversification elsewhere fully removes that tension. It only buys time and reduces how catastrophic the fallout would be if that tension ever broke. This is the strategic lesson worth carrying forward. The next major economic shock is unlikely to begin in a boardroom or a stock exchange. It is far more likely to begin at one of these narrow points on the map, a strait, a canal, an island, where geography, not policy, decides how much leverage a country actually has. The nations building pipelines around Malacca, rail corridors around Suez, and chip factories outside Taiwan are not hedging against unlikely scenarios. They are responding to a pattern that 2026 confirmed in the most direct way possible. Whoever controls the choke point controls the terms, even if only for a few costly months, and even if controlling it costs the controller almost as much as everyone else. So the next time a headline mentions a strait, a canal, or a narrow strip of water most people couldn't point to on a map, it's worth pausing on it rather than scrolling past. Somewhere in that headline is a decision that will eventually move the price of oil at a gas station, the cost of a shipping container, or the availability of a computer chip 6 months from now. Not because of the size of the country involved, not because of the size of its economy or its military, but because of the width of the water it happens to sit beside, and what it has decided that water is worth. That is the real lesson this map has been trying to teach for as long as trade has existed. Power, in the end, is not always about how much territory a country holds. It is about how narrow a gap it happens to control, and how much everyone else is willing to pay to keep that gap open. 21 miles decided that, for months, in 2026. The next number might be smaller. It will not be less consequential. If this kind of analysis is what you come here for, the context behind the headlines, the geography behind the economics, subscribe to Meridian Theory and turn on notifications, because we map out the systems that actually run the world.